today it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Ken Aizawa, who works in the Department of Philosophy at Rutgers. Ken is a philosopher of mind and cognitive science. He has published extremely widely and influential papers on topics such as systematicity, extended mind, the distinction between what is cognition and what is not cognition. He is the author of a book called The Systematicity Argument, and he has edited several volumes in the philosophy of mind and philosophy of cognitive science. Last, but maybe not least, he is a former graduate student of the Department of History and Philosophy of Science, and we're delighted to bring him back here for a talk at the Center for Philosophy of Science. And today, Ken will be talking about Hodgkin and Huxley's use of singular compositional abduction.
Great pleasure. Introduce to you, at least to some of you, because many of you know him, Ken Aizawa, who is currently professor of philosophy at Rutgers University in Newark. He's also an affiliate of RUCS, the Rutgers University Cognitive Science Center, where I spent a few years, long time, long time ago. Ken has published extremely in the philosophy of cognitive science, the philosophy of mind, and the philosophy of science on a range of topics, the bounds of cognition, the systematicity argument. Many of his works, many of his papers are actually classics in the fields of philosophy of cognitive science. We are really delighted to have him here. I just mentioned a few, I mentioned his books. So the systematicity argument, published in 2003. There's the Bounds of Cognition, which is about extended mind, published in 2008. And there's a book coming out next year, Compositional Abduction and Scientific Interpretation. Last but not least, one of the other reasons why we are very happy to have Ken with us today is as a former student of the Department of History and Philosophy of Science. So it's always very nice to get people back. Documents have been as successful as Ken. And today, Ken will be talking about an important topic in the philosophy of neuroscience, Hodgkin and Huxley's use of singular compositional abduction.
Ken, thank you very much.
The floor is yours.
Thank you all for coming out. It's great to be back. It's been 40 years since I first came here. It's kind of hard to believe John and I came here the same year. So one reason I'm happy to be here is because I'm back here. But another part is I'm giving a talk that I think is just right down the middle of HPS. And it's not always welcome, but I think HPS will be welcome here. So my talk begins with a series of papers from 1952 by Alan Hodgkin and Andrew Huxley. And in these 5 papers, the first begins with a technical paper explaining the apparatus that Hodgkin and Huxley would be using. And then 2 through 4 were experimental works reporting on the experiments they'd done with their voltage clamp. And the 5th paper was a mathematical model of their experimental results. Their work from 1952 quickly earned the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1963. I've read that this is a very short order for this particular Nobel Prize. Other prizes are that fast, but usually not physiology or medicine. And since then, the model has become a standard part of neuroscience curricula, and it's about as well established as a theory in neuroscience as there is. So it is a monumental achievement. But philosophers of science have not paid that much attention to this work, right? It's like philosophers of evolutionary biology not reading much Origin of Species. Okay. My talk today, however, begins with a paper I wrote with my neuroscience colleague, Drew Headley, came out in 2002. And I think it's the first paper that begins to discuss the experimental work from Hodgkin and Huxley. And in that paper, we proposed that Hodgkin and Huxley used what we call compositional abduction to support various hypotheses that they had in mind. But one source of friction with reviewers was that we had no theory of compositional abduction. So today I want to introduce that theory. One might also worry that how this theory relates to other theories, such as Peircean abduction, IBE, mutual manipulability. So I'm going to add a few sentences about that. And then one might also worry that a theory of compositional abduction developed to handle one specific case in mid-20th century physiology will not generalize to other cases. And today I'm going to address that concern as well. It seems to me that singular compositional abduction is just the reasoning of cognitive science and neuroscience. That there are vast tracts of cognitive science that just would not exist if we did not have singular compositional abduction. Okay. So I'm going to do 5 things in my talk today. So I made a mistake on the handout, misnumbered things. But I will begin by introducing an example of Hodgkin and Huxley's reasoning, then provide a theory of that case. Then I'm going to quickly make some suggestions about how my approach differs from others. I want to then indicate other cases to which the theory may apply. And finally, I'm going to show the theory, how the theory might advance the debate over the scientific legitimacy of mental representations. Now, in my experience, no one cares about what Hodgkin Huxley did, but people really care about mental representation. So I'm going to go from someplace where I think people care. In this talk, I feel the most trepidation about 3, because again, no one cares about Hodgkin and Huxley. So what people will care about is, well, what did Peirce think? And so many people will want to talk at length about what Peirce thought. But my paper is not a refutation of Peirce. I'm not trying to refute Lipton. I'm not trying to refute mutual manipulability. But I'm going to talk about this briefly as mere means of orientation. Okay, so the experiment. So in the experiment I'll be looking at, Hodgkin and Huxley depolarized an axon by 65 millivolts, and then they measured the current. So initially there was an inward current, which is marked by this rise, peaks at about 1 millisecond, slowly declines, and you get an outward current. And they did 3 runs of this experiment with their axon number 15. And in the first run, they voltage clamped the axon to minus 65 millivolts and measured the current in a sodium containing medium. Then they voltage clamped the axon number 15 by minus 65 millivolts, measured the current in a sodium free medium. Then they returned the axon to the sodium containing medium. So these are the results. And this is Hodgkin-Huxley's figure 1. And they have 3 comments about this, but I'm going to focus on just the first one. They write, the most important features shown in figure 1 are the following. When the external sodium concentration was reduced to 0, the inward current disappeared. So the inward current is the little upward hill, and was replaced by an early hump in the outward current. That's this little dip here. So here's what they thought was going on. When you have external sodium, the voltage clamp increases the permeability of the membrane to sodium so that sodium rushes down its concentration gradient and generates an inward current. Then in the second run, when you remove the sodium, then you voltage clamp. It again increases the membrane permeability and the sodium fluxes out, and that creates the outward current. And then when we restore the external sodium, you get the same thing. Yeah. So that is the experiment. Now, here's a kind of feature that's I'll return to a number of times. What they did was they voltage clamped axon number 15, then measured the current, and then postulated unmeasured sodium fluxes. They couldn't get at the sodium ions, right? They didn't have ionic tweezers, for example. Okay, they just postulated this is what's going on. Okay, so here's the theory. First pass. We proposed in 2022 that Hodgkin and Huxley used compositional abduction. So what's abduction? I say it's inference to some hypothesis H because H explains E. Now, this is a thin conception of abduction. It's deliberately so. So it's not necessarily what you would think of as IBE. So let your hypothesis be, say, a deer walked through here. Why would you think that? Well, that hypothesis H explains E. There are these marks in the snow. This is sort of a boring textbook example. Okay, and I want to build on that by saying compositional abduction is inference to some hypothesis H because H compositionally explains E. So that's what I want to build up for theory, in a theory. First bit, kind of trivial. Hodgkin and Huxley used the results of a controlled experiment. And by this, I mean nothing fancy. Hodgkin and Huxley voltage clamped the axon in a sodium-containing medium, then a sodium-free medium, then a sodium-containing medium. And what they hoped to do was have two conditions that are exactly the same, except for one condition. Now, in fact, they didn't get that, and I'll come back to why that's important. So it's under idealization that they assume that you have S, the axon, generates initial inward, has an initial inward current, which is generated by sodium ions moving out, moving in. And then you have the axon number 15, the initial outward current generated by sodium ions moving out. And then you have an inward current. But strictly speaking, what was going on without idealization was that the axon was slowly dying. This is just what happens when you use neurons. They die over time. And so what was really going on was, first you have S psi generated by ions fluxing in. Then somewhat later, you have an axon somewhat degenerated, producing an outward current, having an outward current. And then you have, in the third run, a somewhat more degenerated axon producing a somewhat degenerated inward current by, again, ions fluxing in. Okay. With their experiment, they generated experimental results. Okay, so better experimental results. So here I'm going to introduce some new terminology. Data are what register on measuring devices such as oscilloscopes, whereas data are things in the world scientists are trying to measure. In this case, they're axonal currents. Maybe another term for results would be data targets. And the idea is that data targets are what the data aim for. To explain this, let me begin with terminology from Bogan and Woodward. They have this distinction between data and phenomena. I'm not using their distinction, but many of us around here know this, so I want to use that as an expository tool. So they say, as a rough approximation, data are what registers on a measurement or recording device in a form which is accessible to the human perceptual system and to public inspection. I agree with that. Examples of data include bubble chamber photographs, patterns of discharge in electronic particle detectors, and reactions and records of reaction times and error rates in various psychological experiments. So to my mind, oscilloscope traces are roughly similar to bubble chamber photographs insofar as both present measurements that are acceptable to public inspection and to the human perceptual system. Phenomena. Woodward says, phenomena, as I use the term, are relatively stable and general features of the world, which are potential objects of explanation and prediction by theory. Now, for Bogan and Woodward, data are idiosyncratic to specific experimental contexts, whereas phenomena are not. So data, the readings that Hodgkin Huxley produced, were based on one species of squid using one kind of, or one design of microelectrode. Curtis and Cole, working in the United States at the Marine Biological Laboratory in Woods Hole, they used a different species of squid, and they used electrodes of different design. So data are, for both myself, Bogan and Woodward, idiosyncratic, whereas phenomena are general. Now, I introduce my distinction between data results for expository purposes. It's different than data and phenomena. Now, maybe Woodward and Bogan would agree with these ideas, but maybe not. What I mean by data, what's important for me about data is that data are spatio-temporal particulars. They occur at specific times and places. So they are individual members of, say, axonal currents that occur at specifiable times and places. So this is why I have belabored the point that the data are from one axon, number 15, and they are collected in 3 different runs, and they were all done a few minutes apart in the summer of 1949. Now, for each spatiotemporal datum I propose, a scientist aims to hit a spatiotemporal result. The scientist aims to have one perceptually accessible spatiotemporal particular indicate something about another, typically perceptually inaccessible spatiotemporal particular. So Hodgkin Huxley meant for this oscilloscope datum over here on this device to indicate a current in an axon over here. Now, I use meant because the data may not hit the target. Or one could put the matter another way. Ideally, a single spatiotemporally localizable trace on an oscilloscope indicates a single spatio-temporally localizable axonal current. Now, just to be clear, when Hodgkin and Huxley were active during the 1940s, one of their central concerns was to validate their experimental apparatus, that what's going on the oscilloscope really tells them what's going on in terms of potentials and currents. Now, what I'm going to do is actually set aside data. I'm going to be concerned with results. So here's where I am. I propose that Hodgkin and Huxley use the oscilloscope to measure currents in voltage-clamped axons. To describe this more theoretically, I propose that Hodgkin and Huxley generate spatiotemporal particulars on the oscilloscope data, and they took this to indicate the existence of spatiotemporal particulars in the axon results. Then, what they wanted to do was explain what compositionally generated the initial inward current. They wanted to explain this result. And this is where the idea of singular comes in. They're just interested in this one thing. Okay, so what is it to explain results? I've said what I take to be a controlled experiment. I've said what I mean by the results of the experiment. Now I want to explain what it is to explain a result. So I've said that under idealization, you have these three explanations, right? You might think of these three at the top as mechanistic constitutive explanation. They suggest the following explanation seeking why question. Between the three of them, they raise the question, why did axon number 15 display an initial inward ionic current when depolarized by 65 millivolts in a sodium-containing medium, but display an initial outward ionic current when depolarized by 65 millivolts in a sodium-free medium? I've given you their explanation. So answering this question links abduction to the explanation of the results of controlled experiment. Okay, so what's an explanation? We need a theory of explanation. And I take that a single current is an activity instance. It's something the axon does at one particular spatial-temporal point in time. Now, to give my theory of explanation, I want to begin with what is sometimes called a conception of explanation. This goes back to Salmon and his works in the 1980s. And here I borrow from Jaegwon Kim, 1994. Okay, so Kim develops what he sometimes called a realist conception of explanation, according to which an explanation is a representation of an ontological dependence relation among entities in the world. This has simply subsequently been discussed in the new mechanism literature in different terms. In other words, an explanation represents entities to be explained, explanand of entities, explaining entities, and an ontological dependence relation between them. Part of what makes this conception realist is the assumption of an ontological dependence relation, a metaphysical relation among entities in the world that empiricists would reject. So here's a crucial passage from Kim. We speak of the causal dependence of one event or state on another. That is one type of dependence, obviously one of central importance. Another dependence relation, orthogonal to causal dependence and equally central to our scheme of things, is mereological dependence. The properties of a whole may depend on the properties and relations had by its parts. Perhaps even the existence of a whole, say a table, depends on the existence of its parts. We can think of the principle of mereological supervenience as a metaphysical principle underwriting the research strategy of microreduction and the method of microreductive explanation, in the way in which the principle of causal determination provides a metaphysical basis for the research strategy of causal investigation and causal explanation. So here's the picture. There is causal ontological dependence and mereological ontological dependence. There are causal explanations and there are mereological explanations. Causal explanations are representations of causal relations between explanandum entities and explanandens entities, and mereological explanations are representations of mereological relations between explanandum entities and explanans entities. Okay. Now, I've not reviewed Kim's view just to take it on board. The currents are not properties and they're not individuals, they are activity instances. So strictly speaking, they are not the relata of Kim's mereological ontological dependence relation. What is needed is an ontological dependence relation that takes activity instances as relata. And here I think what we need is a relation of implementation. So, interim summary, a singular compositional explanation is a representation of a compositional ontological dependence relation implementation between activity instances. So, what's implementation? Okay, it is an ontological dependence relation. It has multiple features. I'm going to present today just three that I think I can present relatively quickly. So I claim that Hodgkin and Huxley implicitly assume that implementation has these three features. It is an asymmetric relation. It is a relation of natural dependence. The relata are contemporaneous. Question: why think Hodgkin and Huxley think that the ontological dependence relation is asymmetric? My answer is they suppose that the sodium hypothesis explains the initial inward current, but they never write about the initial inward ionic current explaining the sodium hypothesis. In other words, they take the influx of sodium to explain the initial inward ionic current, but they do not take the initial inward ionic current to explain the sodium flux. Question number 2. Why think that Hodgkin and Huxley think that the ontological dependence relation is a natural dependence relation? Well, by a natural dependence relation, I mean a relation that holds under certain background conditions. The most familiar of these are temperature and pressure. So natural dependence relations, such as my idea of implementation, which I actually got from Carl Gillett, differ from non-natural dependence relations, such as entailment, in the conditionalization on background conditions. So A's entailing A is not conditioned by background conditions such as temperature and pressure. And Hodgkin and Huxley think that the axon operates only within a specific range of temperatures, so they think it's a natural dependence relation. Number 3, why think that Hodgkin and Huxley think that the ontological dependence relation has contemporaneous relata? Well, I suppose that the inward ionic current takes place from, say, T0 to T1, which is about a millisecond. Further, that the influx of sodium takes place in about the same time, T0 to T1. And this is what it is for the relation of implementation to be contemporaneous. They occur within the same time frame. So here's the whole theory. Implementation is a natural, asymmetric, natural ontological dependence relation among spatially temporal, localized, contemporaneous activity instances. Singular dynamic compositional explanations are representations of implementation relations between spatio-temporally localized contemporaneous activity instances. Singular dynamic compositional abductive inferences are matters of inferring some hypothesis H, because H provides a singular dynamic compositional explanation E. Results of experiments are what data are supposed to indicate. The interpretation of results of experiments are sometimes based on singular dynamic compositional abductive inference. And finally, the interpretation of the results of controlled experiments are sometimes based on singular dynamic compositional abductive inference. Okay, so that's a lot. Now I could give a whole talk on just the theory, but that's probably already more detailed than anyone wants. Okay. Part 2, how does this approach differ from others? Well, what about Peirce? Peirce is the philosopher most famously associated with abduction. Peirce thought that scientists use abduction to introduce hypotheses, or maybe to introduce hypotheses that are worthy of further investigation. I don't think that. I think abduction is used for confirmation. So Hodgkin and Huxley did not use their first experiment to introduce the sodium hypothesis. That had already been introduced in 1949. Moreover, they did 3 experiments, right? There's no point in introducing the sodium hypothesis only to introduce the sodium hypothesis, only to introduce the sodium hypothesis. What I think they were doing is trying to confirm the sodium hypothesis. And they later claimed that that's what they're doing with their experimental work. So I think abduction isn't for merely introducing hypotheses, it is for confirmation. What does this have to do with Harman? Well, Harman thought that warranted abduction is inference to the best explanation. So I don't assume that Hodgkin and Huxley were warranted in adopting the sodium hypothesis after the first experiment. So here's what people familiar with science, I think, will recognize, that scientists will do one experiment and think, well, that's a reason, but maybe we need more reasons. And maybe we need more reasons that will rule out rival hypotheses. So you do more experiments. So this is the nature of scientific investigation. So I don't assume that scientists like Hodgkin and Huxley were using warranted abduction. They were just using abduction. Maybe unwarranted, maybe not. Think about the Semmelweis case for a minute, right? Most of you know the Semmelweis case. This is probably the most famous example in the IB literature. My account applies to individual experiments in the Semmelweis case. So, as you may know, the Semmelweis case involves Ignaz Semmelweis trying to figure out what is the cause of childbed fever. And one hypothesis he entertained was that, well, it's because a priest walks through Ward 1, but not through Ward 2, that maybe the priest is the cause of the higher mortality rate in Ward 1 rather than Ward 2. And he tests this and finds out, oh, well, if the priest doesn't walk through there, it makes no difference. Okay, so I say that's abductive disconfirmation. But it's not what one might stereotypically think of as IBE, because it's just the elimination of one rival hypothesis, not all the others. There was another rival hypothesis that it was due to the position in which women delivered. And he did a subsequent experiment changing the position in which women delivered, and he found that that didn't make a difference either. So I think IBE is more plausibly viewed as a model of, say, the whole of Semmelweis's reasoning. What we need, in addition, however, is some reasoning that accounts for what's going on with the priest and what's going on with, say, changing position. So I think my account is not IBE, at least that understood that way. Think again about Lipton. Lipton at one point writes, of course, there is always more than one possible explanation for any phenomenon. The tracks may have been, instead, caused by a trained monkey on snowshoes or by the elaborate etchings of an environmental artist. So we cannot infer something because it is a possible explanation. It must somehow be the best of competing explanations. Now, when Lipton says we cannot infer something, I take it he's not making a claim about human cognitive capacities. Somehow our brains will not work that way. Instead, what I think he means is that we cannot, with warrant, infer something simply because it is a possible explanation. That I think is right. And so it's important to distinguish making an abductive inference, which may or may not be warranted, from coming up with a warranted inference. Okay, so I'm just interested in warranted inference, or sorry, in abductive inference, because that, I think, is the tool that one would use to understand how science works. How does this differ from, say, Craver, Glennon, and Povich's mutual manipulability approach? Well, all the experiments I'm going to consider are intra-level experiments. You manipulate an axon, and then you measure an axonal current. You don't measure what's going on in ions. You postulate, you hypothesize what's going on. By contrast, Craver, Glenn, and Povich propose that philosophers should be guided in their thinking about constitutive relevance, this relation between currents and ion fluxes, by attending to the interlevel experiments scientists use to test whether something is a component in the mechanism. If you follow this advice, you are just not going to look at the Hodgkin-Huxley case. In fact, I think you're going to miss a vast number of cases. So let me turn to that now. Singular compositional abduction in other contexts. So how does an account developed to handle a specific case, one experiment, apply to other cases? People might think this is just an outrageous proposal. I now would indicate how I think it applies elsewhere. Here's, I think, the general feature of the HA experiment, that you manipulate an individual and then you measure some feature of that very individual, then hypothesize something at a lower level. This, I contend, is a pervasive pattern in science. It's prevalent in neuroscience and psychology. Now, let me harp on this a bit. There is essentially nothing about this in the philosophy of science. Now, one might have thought that this is something like inference to the best explanation, where the explanation is mechanistic constitutive explanation. Here are two ideas that probably everyone in this room knows, right? IBE, mechanistic constitutive explanation. Well, how hard would it be to put those together? Seems like someone should have thought of this. But as far as I know, there is no such proposal out there yet. I think that to a first approximation, singular compositional abduction is that, IB with mechanistic constitutive explanation. But there's nothing on this in the literature, so I have this bold idea that this is the most under-theorized scientific reasoning in all of contemporary philosophy of science. Could be wrong, but go big or go home. Well, here's a case. Take Chomskyan transformational grammar. Right? This is not a real case study. This is just a suggestive example. So this is from Chomsky, 1965. He writes, if a sentence such as flying planes can be dangerous is presented in an appropriately structured context, the listener will interpret it immediately in a unique way and will fail to detect the ambiguity. In fact, he may reject the second interpretation when this is pointed out to him as forced or unnatural, independently of which interpretation he originally selected under contextual pressure. Nevertheless, his intuitive knowledge of the language is clearly such that both of the interpretations corresponding to flying planes are dangerous and flying planes is dangerous are assigned to the sentence by the grammar he has internalized in some form. So you have Smith. So here's what I think Chomsky is implicitly thinking. Here's Smith. He has this mental grammar. When Smith hears this sentence, this string, he produces one parse tree, one corresponding to say flying planes are dangerous. That's the explanation of what's going on with Smith. By contrast, over here is Jones. When Jones hears flying planes can be dangerous, Jones generates another parse tree, and that explains why he answers the way he does. So I think if you dig down a little bit, you can see that maybe Chomsky was reasoning using singular compositional abduction. Think about the preferential looking paradigm in child developmental psychology. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of experiments like this. Let me just pick one that might illustrate this. So in these experiments, you have an infant sitting on a caregiver's lap. And there's they have the infant looking at a table, and then a gray screen is introduced. And things are contrived so that, let's say, a blue cylinder comes out from behind the screen, then goes back. Then a red ball comes out from behind the screen, then it goes back. Now, when the screen falls, we adults will not be surprised to find a red ball and a blue cylinder. By contrast, it appears that when infants watch this, they are surprised by two. And Susan Carey's view is that what's going on is adults have an object tracking system that tracks according to property and kind information like color and shape, whereas infants track objects based on spatiotemporal contiguity. So all they ever see is one object come out. So they think, oh, well, there's one object. Okay, I don't know if that's the right account, but it looks to me as though what Carey is doing is she's taking one infant, Susie maybe, and postulating in her this system that works this way. So I think singular compositional abduction underlies these sorts of experiments. What about false belief tasks? Again, I think there are hundreds, if not thousands, of experiments like this. I'm just going to pick one because I found a cartoon that illustrates it. Nothing special about this at all, just easy. So you have this adult, and the adult asks this, let's say, 3-year-old boy, what do you think is in the box? In the box, you may not be able to see it, but it says Smarties. Somehow, maybe it's not written, maybe it's just decorated to look like Smarties. And so the boy says, Smarties, pretty enthusiastically. The adult says, why don't you open the box and see? And the boy says, oh, it's pencils. And the boy's kind of dejected. The adult says, let's close the box. What do you say? What do you think your friend Jenny would say is in the box if she saw it? And the boy enthusiastically says, pencils. Now, a common way these experiments are interpreted is to say that the boy does not yet have a capacity to attribute to others false beliefs. I don't know if that's right or not. I'm not really concerned whether it's right or not. My point is this looks like it is singular compositional abductive image. You're proposing that in this boy's head, there's a particular structure. Okay, last case. Philosophers and psychologists working on mental representation often have the idea that representations are sometimes used to explain animal behavior and that the ability of such explanations to explain behavior provides some sort of reason to believe in those representations. This is one way in which philosophers and psychologists make an experimental case for postulating mental representations. So prima facie, philosophers and psychologists are implicitly thinking abductively. But there are, of course, those philosophers and psychologists and neuroscientists who resist postulating mental representations. Sometimes the reasoning takes the form of doubting the legitimacy of abductive inference, and it is open to doubt. And sometimes it takes the form of suggesting that abductive reasoning provides something less than a reason to believe in a hypothetical mental representation. Prima facie, part of what's going on appears to be some ambiguity about what abductive reasoning shows, but what is definitely going on here is that there is no articulated theory of abduction, and my suggestion is that having a theory could be illuminating. So take an example. In an influential 1948 psychological review paper, Edward Tolman argued that rats sometimes navigate mazes using a cognitive map rather than simpler stimulus response strategies. Such maps, he proposed, indicate routes and paths and environmental relationships, which finally determine what responses, if any, the animal will finally release. So here's a super simple experiment. I like things simple. So this is a Y maze. There's food in one goal arm and water in the other. The experiment has 20 rats. So you release a rat in the start box and you just let it wander through the maze, and it goes to both the arms and figures out where everything is. Afterwards, then you make 10 of the rats hungry and 10 of the rats thirsty. Then on day one, you let a hungry rat go, and it goes to the food. Totally unsurprising to us, I suppose. By contrast, the thirsty rats, they will go to the water, unsurprisingly. Well, think about how to apply the HH model to this model. So let me say that in the HH case, there were 10 axons, number 15, and then 9 others. So you have, each of these is an explanation, right? There's S1, sodium, no sodium, sodium, S2, sodium, no sodium, sodium, blah, blah, blah. Similarly, you could tell this kind of story for the rats on day one of testing. You have 10 rats, and you might just suppose that let S1 through S10 be the rat going to the food, and S11 to S20 be thirsty rats going to the water. I think in each case, for each rat, you're going to get a compositional explanation. So on its face, at least to me, in the HH example, compositional abductive inference supports the view that the initial inward current of the action potential is implemented by sodium. And I suggest by parity of reasoning in the Tolman example, compositional abductive inference supports the view that rats navigate mazes using cognitive maps. So I think that's implicitly what's going on. But skeptics have long directed at least part of their skepticism to the very idea of abductive reasoning. The idea is that abduction does something less than guide us to the existence of things. The idea is that abduction gives us something less than empirical support for what Bill Ramsey, among others, calls robust representational realism. So consider some comments from B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner seems to think that abductive reasoning is just a trick. So he writes in Verbal Behavior, 1957, it has generally been assumed that to explain behavior, or any aspect of it, one must attribute it to events taking place inside the organism. In the field of verbal behavior, this practice was once represented by the doctrine of the expression of ideas. An utterance was felt to be explained by setting forth the ideas which it expressed. If the speaker had had a different idea, he would have uttered different words or words in a different arrangement. If his utterance was unusual, it was because of the novelty or originality of his ideas. All properties of verbal behavior seem to be thus accounted for. He then continues. The difficulty is that the ideas for which sounds are said to stand as signs cannot be independently observed. If we ask for evidence of their existence, we are likely to be given a restatement of the words, but a restatement is no closer to the idea than the original utterance. There is obviously something suspicious in the ease with which we discover in a set of ideas precisely those properties needed to account for the behavior which expresses them. We evidently construct the ideas at will from the behavior to be explained. There is, of course, no real explanation. And it seems to me Skinner's influence continues to this day. Rosa Cow, is her name pronounced Cow or Sal? Cow? Cow, okay, I thought I heard it as Cow. Rosa Cow has something sort of like this. What it is to be in possession of certain representations is, on this view, to exhibit certain counterfactually robust behavioral profiles. If a system behaves as if it is using an internal store of information to solve certain kinds of problems, or employing internal proxies to reason about external affairs and plot out its future actions, then it must have representations, whatever their internal physical manifestation. So representations are presumed rather than discovered. So it's kind of a trick. The relationship between complex behavior and internal representations is so tight that it's not possible, and perhaps not even conceivable, for a creature to display complex behaviors and dispositions without it having representations. So once again, it seems as if representations are explananda, another counterfactually robust way of describing behaviors to be explained, but not an independent source for explaining them. Okay. So let me go back just to Skinner. Skinner claims that the difficulty is that the ideas for which sounds are said to stand as signs cannot be independently observed. But this is sort of the point of abduction. An inability to independently observe things is part of the rationale for abduction. Abduction is meant to get a scientist beyond the observable or measured. In the Hodgkin-Huxley case, abduction was used because the flux of ions cannot be independently observed. Take another case. This is familiar from the IBU literature. Geologists sometimes observe that there is a layer of sediment found in many parts of the globe that has a uncommonly high concentration of iridium. One hypothesis has been that this is due to a meteor impact that created a global event that spread iridium over large parts of the Earth. The meteor impact, having happened in the distant past, is not independently observable. But at least some scientists believe in the meteor impact because the impact would explain the iridium layer. Next, Skinner claimed there is obviously something suspicious in the ease with which we discover in a set of ideas precisely those properties needed to account for the behavior which expresses them. There is, of course, no real explanation. Now, notice that we really do, in an abductive argument, want to explain the phenomena, right? You'd fail if you didn't explain the behavior to be explained. But also, Skinner offers what seems to be a caricature of the abductive approach. So suppose Joan says, "I'm hungry." Skinner thinks it is vacuous to explain that Joan said that she is hungry because she is hungry, or that she believes she's hungry. It's not vacuous. Jones might have said she's hungry because she is hungry or believes she's hungry. Or she might have said she is hungry because she could not stand to listen to Smith yammer on about his stamp collection for another minute and just had to find some polite way to excuse herself. She could have been lying. Okay, now my goal today is not to refute Skinner or Bennett or Cow, nor is it to sell you on mental representations. Mental representations are pretty popular. My goal instead is to sell you on the importance of singular compositional abduction. There is a much harder to sell insofar as no one's ever heard of singular compositional abduction before. It is, I think, a kind of scientific reasoning that has largely been untheorized in the philosophy of science. Let me dwell on just this last point a bit. Skinner and Bennett and Cow might object to the analogy between Hodgkin, Huxley, and Tolman. Why? Because there's a point of difference. And there's this one. Hodgkin, Huxley specified individuals and activity instances in their explanation. The individuals at the lower level, the explananda, were sodium ions. The activity instances were their transmembrane ionic movements. By contrast, Tolman named neither individuals nor activity instances. To make this concrete, consider an anachronistic illustration. Tolman did not say that individual cells in the hippocampus were the individuals and that their firings were the activities that were relevant. He just didn't know. Okay. Now, some might say, okay, so Tolman wasn't doing what Hodgkin Huxley were doing. And I think there's a lot of sympathy for this view, so I want to forestall it. It's not that simple. Unspecified activities individuals are not as scientifically scientifically problematic as one might think. So let me give you two examples. Here's the first one. I mentioned early on, and now I come back to it, that Hodgkin and Huxley believed that over the course of an experiment, the axon runs down. Why did they think this? Well, they observed that over the course of several hours, the resting potentials, the acting potentials, and the currents of the axon grew weaker. What explains this? The axon was dying. Why did they think this? This would explain why the potentials changed as they did. Could Hodgkin and Huxley name individuals or activities in the cells as part of this explanation? No, they couldn't. Curtis and Cole, Americans working at Woods Hole, working in the 1940s, they comment, some axons remained excitable for as long as 4 hours after impalement. Usually, the end which was punctured became inactive very soon, and starting from that point, the rest of the axon would slowly become inactive. Curtis and Cole also thought the cell was dying. Why did they think that? Because that would explain why the inactivity proceeds from the point of insertion of the microelectrode down the axon. Maybe not an ironclad explanation, but that's what I think they thought was going on. Second example. From the very beginning, Hodgkin and Huxley knew that you can't touch the electrode to the membrane. That's going to screw up the axon. So they spent like 2 hours dissecting out these axons. So they didn't want to screw them up. And so they actually developed apparatus that prevented this. So what they hypothesized was that the microelectrodes touching the membrane would damage the membrane. Could they specify the individuals that were damaged? No, they didn't know very much about what was in the membrane. They didn't know about ion channels. Could they specify what activities were altered? No. So they couldn't specify the individuals or the activities, but did they get flack from other neurophysiologists about this? No, not as far as I know. So to conclude my discussion of abduction mental representation, let me say that there is much more to be explored here. The theory of singular compositional abduction offers a framework for formulating issues. Moreover, as I've tried to hint just now, the mid-20th century work in physiology has a lot of subtlety that is worthy of further attention in its own right. So let me wrap up. So today I tried to do 5 things. I introduced the example of the Hodgkin and Huxley's reasoning. I provided a theory of that case, maybe a little fast, maybe not as much as you want, maybe more than you want. I've hinted at how my approach differs from other approaches that might come to mind. I've indicated some examples where it might also apply just very, very quickly. And because I don't think people care about Hodgkin and Huxley, but they do care about mental representation, I've told a story about how singular compositional abduction applies to theory of mental representation. Thank you.
Should we try and get your way through and then we'll have time for questions?